right, yeah, let's get this show on the road. Yeah, thanks a lot to your overwhelming interest on this webinar. We had an inkling in the past months that, yeah, the high-value datasets topic would be one that might be of interest to many. So I'm really interested also in, yeah, presenting our thoughts and ideas on the topic and how we interpret things and getting your feedback today. So yeah, first of all, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Thorsten Reitz. I'm co-founder and CEO of wetransform. We are mostly known for implementing standards like Inspire and Xplanung and yeah, also things like the noise directive and similar activities. And obviously that's very much related to the high-value datasets activity now. So we've been approached quite a bit on that subject, and yeah, I would like to share our thoughts on that as they stand today. So first of all, I think most of you actually know us. We are a startup from Germany, based in Darmstadt, that's south of Frankfurt, with a goal really of enabling and building green data ecosystems. So getting all that spatial data and environmental data out there and enabling people to use that. So this act of providing high-value data set very much fits up our avenue. We have at the core two products. One is Hail Studio, an open source software for data transformation, and the other one, Hail Connect, basically a cloud platform for providing data sets, making them accessible, interoperable, and so on, and implementing things like Inspire. I've mentioned it briefly. So at this state, we have more than 1,300 organizations who already use these tools, and we are currently publishing more than 75,000 Inspire data sets. So actually twice the amount of network services. So I think that's quite a bit of scale. And so we have a little bit of experience in kind of implementing things that are similar to the high-value datasets directive. So now before I go into the actual presentation, a little bit of organizational things. So first I will talk a little bit about the poll that we did previous to this presentation, basically to hear what kind of questions you have. Then I will do the presentation. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A tool. We will then, after the presentation part, which will take 30-35 minutes, we will try to address these. Then we have an additional little poll prepared to see, okay, so how do you see the things that we are presenting? What is your plans basically to proceed? And then finally, if there's still time, we can also have a bit of discussion on things that are not yet as clear, such as adding particular keywords to metadata. All right, let's get started. So as you remember, we also sent out a link to a small survey, basically trying to understand where people currently are and what kind of questions they have. The first of these questions was, so when do people actually expect to be fully compliant with the high-value datasets implementing regulation? And so there is nobody who said, okay, we are already compliant, which I think is very honest, because there are some organizations that I think are on a very good path. But on the other hand, we don't really fully know yet, to be honest. Like I said, there's things that are still open. So a small number of people said that they would be ready this year, but the majority is basically planning to be ready next year or maybe even later. So we'll see. Where do people currently stand in implementation? So about half of the respondents, it's a small set, but still said they haven't made any specific progress. Some have said, okay, we are basically, we've understood what the requirements are. So we can proceed. Some are buying a solution, and a few are already in the implementation process. Again, nobody said they fully implemented the related work already. Now, you don't need to read this. I will just include that in the slide. So those are all the questions that we got sent and challenges and so on. But to summarize, there's a few things that we took out of this, and that basically boils down to our agenda today. So a few people asked, for example, what's actually the purpose? Why are we doing this? What does it mean to make data findable and accessible? Also, there were questions about data specifications, making data interoperable and reusable. A few questions also about, okay, and how do I actually show that I'm compliant to the requirements? And then we'll look at a few specific things for actually implementing basically the requirements that we've discussed about before. And then at the end, as mentioned, we have the Q&A, feedback, survey or poll, and the discussion. So let's jump right into it. So you probably all have heard multiple times about the European Data Strategy and the Data Act and so on, which is kind of the high-level activity, which in the end is about really enabling a European data market and proper utilization of data to generate value. And the High-value Datasets Act implementing regulation, is part of that, and basically falls into this. No, why doesn't it work? Falls into this particular area here to make more public sector data available specifically. So it has a different scope than, for example, Inspire. This is really about making data more available first and foremost. So the purpose of the high-value datasets implementing regulation is to make more of this public sector data fair. Most of you will have heard this by now. I've added the definitions here on the right-hand side, but in the end, it boils down to making data discoverable, findable. Yeah, that's something that we've also been doing in Inspire, for example, a lot. It means making the data accessible. That means that there is a stable resource where I can actually access, download, interact with the data in some form. I also make the data interoperable and the metadata as well, so that it's easy to combine it and to process it across systems. And I make the data reusable. So that's especially important in terms of enabling others to really use the data, which includes things like documentation, but also the licensing of the data. In this way, by making the data fair, we hope to improve data value allocation. So not have it just collected by one organization, but rather enable many people to profit from that. It ensures trust because there is actually public sector data then out there instead of having some hand-collected other data set. It is also explicitly to remove gatekeepers. So we still have that in many situations that there is somebody sitting on the data and not really providing access to it at all, or under basically untenable conditions. It's supposed to push innovation because people really can't just collect data and sit on it and control innovation, but rather everybody can access the data and make their own innovations with it. And ideally, it should also lead to better support of cross-border data, cross-border use cases, sorry. Yeah, that's basically the key goal. And of course, this implementing regulation isn't alone. It's together with a lot of other things. It basically boils down under this kind of chain from the Data Act to the Data Governance Act to the Markets Act and then the Implementing Act. And it basically supports other activities such as the PSI and Open Data and Inspire. So it's really one small building block of the bigger picture here. But in the end, what we really want to achieve is to invigorate data reuse. So the data that is there that has potentially high value should be made accessible in such a way that organizations, citizens, etc., can really reuse it in many different ways. Another question that we got was basically, okay, now there is this high value data, but in Inspire in particular, we've also heard about priority data a lot. And so I wanted to quickly try to clarify that as well with this nice diagram here on the right-hand side mostly. So in principle, all priority data is Inspire data, and high value data also has some overlap with Inspire and priority data. Don't take this now for a completely quantitative diagram, please. It's just to indicate that there are these overlaps. Sorry. Yeah, and some data sets are actually in scope of all three of these. One thing that is different, however, is that the High-value Data Act explicitly states that the data inside this green part, in this case, needs to be licensed under specific conditions. And there is no such rule for Inspire data or for priority data. So that's definitely one of the bigger differences. So now, what data is actually in scope of the High-value Data Act? That's quite a bit. So we have in total 34 Inspire themes, for example, and out of these, a little bit more than 2/3 are actually also in scope of the High-value Datasets Act. So there's 6 different, you could say, categories of data that are in scope of the HVD Act. This includes geospatial, Earth observation and environment, meteorological data, statistics, and companies and ownerships, and finally mobility. I'm going to somewhat disregard these 3, meteorological, statistics, companies, and company ownerships, because I think for the community that has mostly worked with geospatial and environmental and so on data, the other 3 are naturally more relevant. So looking at this, we can see there are 6 geospatial themes. There is 14 Inspire themes that have that are also in the category of Earth observation environment, plus a whole bunch of other topics. So they didn't fit in all there, but there's also about 7 or 8 other topics in environment that are not directly mapped to an Inspire theme. And finally, for mobility, there's the different transport networks. So all in all, there is, as you can see, quite a bit of overlap between the different regulations. So the other question is typically, okay, now I know a data set is in this and this theme, but do I actually still need it? Does it count? First of all, there's often the distinction about, basically the time, how old is the data set and how frequently does it need to be updated? And one thing that's basically clear is you always need to publish the most current version. And what most current means is really quite different depending on what data it actually is. So in some cases, like weather stations, weather radar, it can be 5 to 10 minutes. So here the expectation is that your data is actually updated every few minutes, and that can be quite challenging. Also for other things like alerts or weather models, there's sub-daily update cycles, even for climate data, like summaries of how many hours of sunshine, temperatures, etc. This data is supposed to be updated daily. However, for most geospatial and environmental data, that also falls under Inspire, the update cycle is like we are pretty much used to, at least every 6 months. The High-VD, the HVD also actually applies to historical data sets. So there are some categories in particular in Earth observation and environment where the goal is to really provide time series of the data, not just the most up-to-date version. So this is an important aspect because often you can basically train models quite well on time series, and you can recognize trends and similar things. However, for this historical data, the requirements that we will later see are a bit relaxed. And for example, they could only be offered through bulk download, so that don't necessarily need to be provided through a full API. The regulation also states that data on a national or subnational level, depending on where it's applicable, needs to be provided, and that all scales down to 1 to 5,000 or better when available are in scope. So most data under these Inspire themes that we've seen before and also under the other topics will actually be relevant for this act. Okay, so that's kind of the purpose and context of the HVD Act. So let's go a little bit deeper into the details. The first thing really is making data findable and accessible. This is something that we've been working on also in Inspire and other SDI projects for quite a long time. And here the framework is a little bit different. So first thing typically to make data findable is that you actually publish information about your data asset in the form of metadata. I'm not going to read the full requirements to you, but basically it really boils down to, for most cases that I've listed before, you can just use Inspire metadata as you've always been. You need to indicate the relevant Inspire theme and or other keywords. And that's what I mentioned earlier, still quite a bit of discussion going on, whether also specific keywords for high-value dataset identification need to be added. And there's also discussion in the DCAT AP group that will basically also result in a proposal how DCAT AP metadata will actually include the relevant information for the metadata. Few things that I do want to call out. One thing that's really important is that in your access and use conditions, you do point out to the licensing conditions. So we come back to that. And we also have to provide information on the terms of use of the API and potential quality of service criteria. So there is some information that needs to be either in the dataset metadata or in the service metadata related to your high-value datasets. And obviously, these datasets then need to be collected in, for example, some central portal, like we already typically have them both for open data and for spatial data throughout the European Union. Then after we've made the data findable through metadata and the relevant portals, the next thing we need to do is actually make it accessible. And at the core, what the High-value Datasets Implementing Act requires is that you make data accessible through an API. And it doesn't really describe in great detail what specifically that is, though there are a few things where, for example, it suggests the APIs that are also accepted in Inspire as direct access download services. However, what it does say is that basically data has to be made available in machine readable formats via APIs corresponding to the reasonable needs of reusers. So there's some freedom in here basically to say, okay, what are people really using? What can they actually integrate? It also says that, again, the terms of use of the API and QoS criteria need to be documented. The terms of use shall be accompanied by API documentation and so on. So that's basically requirements on the particular API, including that you need to provide a contact. Given that these are relatively abstract requirements, there's also a lot of different options to implement them. So maybe the good news, so to speak, if you have already worked on Inspire, you will, for most cases, already have a solution in place. Things like the web feature service, API features, or for raster data, the web coverage service, or for observations and sensor data, sensor observation service and sensor things API, basically all fit this bill. There's also the environmental data retrieval API that would also be an option. It's just not yet, I think last time I checked, at least it wasn't accepted as an Inspire good practice. However, the one thing that's a bit thin is if you really have purely tabular data. And I did take quite a long research round, basically trying to find whether there's really a suitable, like internationally adopted, standardized way of accessing tabular data without a spatial component. And I didn't really find one that's applicable to our community. So the documents that I did find basically say, okay, just specify an open API with some simple filtering possibilities and then deliver CSV, for example. So do something relatively simple. There's the other thing that's also there in addition to APIs is the so-called bulk download option. So basically being able to download the whole data set at once. And in many cases, this can actually be done via the APIs that are listed here as well. So really, I think my understanding of the requirements here is that you can actually consider that a function of the APIs that might in some cases also be provided in a different way. So basically the same requirements still apply, but as mentioned, in some cases, it's also sufficient to actually only have the bulk download option and not any smarter like querying functionality and subsetting and aggregation and so on. So to summarize, basically what you can do is you can either use for bulk download the APIs that we listed before, but you could also provide something like Atom Feed or Stack, the spatial temporal asset catalog, or just create direct links to the files and archives from the metadata. So all of these are basically usable and fine, and especially Atom Feed and directly linking to data from the metadata are things that are working pretty universally for any type of data, easy to use, etc. So especially in the direct link case. Another option is also to use the DCAT-based open data catalog. So those are not as focused on spatial data at all and can easily be used also to provide access to tabular data. In the end, again, it's not really an API, it's just a way of finding those tabular resources. And again, you can also provide something like a simple open API with filter abilities that return CSVs. There is a side note on that, very much like there had been a spatial data on the web activity in the spatial community and in the OGC. There has been a very similar activity for tabular data. And for those who don't know it, it's worth a read to quickly check this out, which we've linked here. All right, so those are your options for bulk download. So now that we've made the data findable and accessible, next question is, okay, what do we do about the INDR, making it interoperable and reusable? And I'll address the, from my perspective, easier thing first, because there it's really very clear. And that's data licensing. So in principle, the implementing act is really clear on that. High-value datasets shall be made available for reuse under the conditions of the Creative Commons public domain dedication. That's basically a license without any constraints, or alternatively, the Creative Commons by 4.0 license. So by means that you need to actually attribute when you use the data, like the original owner of the data needs to be mentioned when you, or you need to give them credit when you use the data. Whereas in CC0, there are absolutely no constraints. But that's about your choice. However, they also say that you could use any equivalent or less restrictive open license. So in principle, I guess it will also be possible to apply national licenses as long as their conditions are very similar. There are some exemptions. So for example, data sets where a GDPR assessment has ruled out publication. So there could in principle be some information that can be associated with natural persons and so on. In that case, that wouldn't work. And there can also be kind of a grace period of up to 24 months, for example, for organizations which currently generate significant revenue with these data sets that they are now supposed to be making available. And these exemptions always need to be published as part of the reporting that comes later. But yeah, in principle, it's pretty clear. And yeah, for me, it's really interesting to see how many exemptions there will be, because in principle, there's a lot of interesting data that falls under this act that is not yet open data across Europe. So after that easier part comes one that's a bit more involved. That's the question about data harmonization. I guess most of you know that Inspire has made very detailed rules about how to harmonize data, how to encode it, etc. And in some cases that generated quite a bit of work. In this case, the rules are a bit more heterogeneous and often, very brief. So the High-value Datasets Implementing Act doesn't prescribe its own data models, for example. However, what it does do is that by data category, it gives different requirements. Like, for example, metrological and statistical data needs to be provided in certain formats like SDMX or CSV or the like. For transport networks and for reference parcels and agricultural parcels, it's actually just explicitly referring to Inspire, saying, okay, these need to be provided compliant to the respective Inspire implementing rule and technical guidance. However, for the other geospatial and environmental data, there's usually no format prescribed. But what they do write is that semantic harmonization is required. So you don't get to just publish the data as is, you need to do something in addition. And the two requirements are the dataset shall be described in a complete and publicly available online documentation, describing at least the data structure and semantics. So you do need to create documentation if you're not harmonizing your data to some format that is already fully documented, like the Inspire data specifications. Furthermore, you are also required to use union or internationally recognized and publicly documented controlled vocabularies and taxonomies where available. So for all Inspire themes, these are definitely available. So you will also have to use them. So how to proceed with that? Maybe 2 notes before that. So if you do provide data, it should still be in an open format. So that's also explicitly required. So no shapefiles and file geodatabases. Yeah, there's enough open formats like JSON and GeoPackage and so on. But yeah, no shapefiles, please. And the second thing is, so if you did already do your Inspire homework, you're basically done with these requirements. Yeah, so because you can just refer to the existing documentation, etc., and you have harmonized to the code lists, you're pretty much done with this. One thing that this doesn't require is you to provide GML. So we could look for basically a minimum solution that does without the, let's say, hindrances that this introduced. A possible minimal approach could look like this. So you first, if you don't have it yet, create documentation. In our experience, most of you will have to do that because of the hundreds and thousands of data sets that we've been processing over the years as a company, and before that as a nonprofit, have basically not had any documentation. So usually we had to ask the experts and then they would describe what the data is about. So in our view, you would definitely, in most cases, still have to do some work, maybe a lot of work on your documentation. And we would always recommend to directly create this in a way that it's published on GitHub, for example, and that it's easy to edit, etc. So, but initially you will need to spend quite a bit of time on that if you don't have it. The other thing that you definitely also need to do is to do the semantic harmonization, i.e. mapping whatever values you have to the respective code lists. And this can be quite simple. So there are some Inspire themes where there's a few small code lists and that's it. But in themes like geology, this tends to be the largest block of the whole harmonization work. So there, not so much the simple restructuring of the data is the problem. It's really the semantic mapping. So that work you still need to do. Yeah, then if you have done these two things, basically the last step is to really implement the data set so that you can share it. And for that, in principle, you can just use the schema from the as-is data, but you need to add some fields, like, for example, for the Inspire EU code lists and vocabularies, and also ideally for Inspire ID. So there are some requirements on giving persistent identifiers to stuff, so that still should be done. And then you can basically encode spatial data either as GeoPackage or GeoJSON. For most use cases, I would recommend GeoPackage. And tabular data, like I said here, after doing a lot of review, what I would actually recommend is to encode it just as a CSV, though ideally complying to the RFC 4180. That's a set of rules that basically describes how exactly to encode CSV data so that it's nicely processable and so on. So don't just do any CSV with any random encoding and so on. Really use a specific set of rules for that. Otherwise, you will create a lot of problems downstream. Or alternatively, use something like Parquet. Yeah, Parquet is a binary, very efficient format for tabular data that can be processed with a lot of tools that are out there. It's, however, not a very geospatially type of format. But yeah, very efficient both in storage and access. Yeah, looking forward. So now that we've basically gone through our basic work, we've made the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We actually need to report all of that. And so compared to Inspire, what we do not have here is a central monitoring process where all the data is collected and assessed and so on. Instead, there is a reporting. So basically, you as a member state need to report to the Commission what you've done and where your high-value dataset resources are. And this first reporting is due in December 2024, so in about 1.5 years from now. So about 6 months after the Implementing Act's deadline. And in this report, you basically have to provide a list of specific data sets at the member state levels, or again, where relevant subnational level, which basically reference the metadata. Yeah, so you could have most of the information actually in your catalog service, for example, or DCAT open data portal that you reference, and then basically just link to that and describe it a little bit. What is important is that metadata has to contain for each data set, again, the licensing conditions and the links to where you get the data, to the APIs and or bulk download options. There's also a few things that are less important, like, for example, guidance documents issued by the member state on publishing and reusing their high-value data sets. So if you do provide some national rules, you also need to include them in the report. You need to link any data protection impact assessments that might have impacted whether you publish data. And you also have to note the public sector bodies that have been exempted, as mentioned before. Yeah, and then you need to actually update this every 2 years. So basically what I would expect is that after the first reporting, you'll get feedback from the Commission, maybe on things that you could still improve. And then there will be a follow-up 2 years later where you update all of this. All right, so basically that's the requirements that the Implementing Act lies down and references. So having said that, the question is, yeah, okay, how do we actually implement it? And for that, we also reached out to you again. We wanted to know, yeah, what's kind of important for you in implementing that? And we asked the people to rank different criteria for the solution, such as minimal workload for own staff, the dataset usability, top quality, full compliance, minimal total cost of ownership, and low effort in purchasing process. And the two things that clearly came out on top are the capacity. So you want to really to have minimal workload by this on your own stuff, in the subset at least. And that's something that I thought was very positive, is you also really want to have optimum dataset usability for public and private stakeholders. I think from my perspective, that's probably one of the lessons learned from Inspire, where this was not to the same degree in the focus from day one. And here people really want to have an efficient solution that provides very good dataset usability. Things that were less important were full compliance, but also really much less important total cost of ownership, which me as somebody in a business always surprised a little bit, and low effort in purchasing process. So I think you're all very well used to just dealing with these processes. And yeah, apparently it's not a top consideration. So with these requirements that you've set forth, we've also asked what type of solutions you are considering. And it's not that surprising that self-operated open source products are on the highest level, followed by solutions that are basically provided to you by a different agency. So that we often see that there's a national or other point like an IT center that basically runs a solution for many organizations. And yeah, if we look a little bit at what kind of things we have here, so there are two where you basically outsource the activity, and there are three where you do it yourself to a large degree. Either because you really build a solution or you operate an open source or proprietary product. And one thing that I just noticed when I saw that is that I think if you really look at minimizing your effort, you should definitely not go towards the self-developed custom-built solutions. Those are by far the highest effort. Also for your own stuff, it's high risk, it's higher cost. So you really should only do that if you've basically ruled out all the other options. I mean, there can be good reasons for that, like high frequency updates and other requirements and so on. But this being an open data initiative, I think data protection plays less of a role, and it's really about pushing out the data, making it accessible in a reliable way. And for that, in my view, only for very few cases, something like a custom-built or self-developed solution should be in the focus. Yeah, self-operated open source products. So I think you will definitely be able to get to the goal with all of these. You saw that the requirements as they are listed can be fulfilled today by things like open source components that you run together, but also by, for example, the software as a service as we provided. Yeah, so I mean, I've mentioned this. Yeah, for us, literally, high-value data sets is something that is basically smack into our mission. Yeah, we want to make data more accessible and usable. And we have accordingly also been working in the past months already on making a solution that's basically one option for implementing all of these requirements. Not going to read all of these things, just wanted to say that basically if you are already a user of our platform, or you just want to try it out, you can basically publish your data in a very simple way right now, go to it, and not much later it will actually appear also on the European data portal and things like that. And if you completed the normal metadata input and so on, you will basically have compliance for the largest part. Like I said, there is one or two things that are still open, like whether we have to add some specific keywords, or whether we have to use different ways of indicating the license. Like, for example, to some degree, the European data portal currently expects certain standard licenses, which not everybody's using. And so those are things that might still have to be changed. But anyway, if you would just like to try it out, go to hellconnect.com or reach out to us, and we can just try to show you, okay, this is how you can easily basically make your check marks for both Inspire and the High-value Datasets Act. All right, and that brings us, after a little more than half an hour, to the last part. So first of all, I would really like to have a look at the Q&A and see what kind of questions we got. So. All right, I think I'll start at the top if that's fine. So Emmanuel asked, how can interoperability be ensured if API requirements are vague or open? That's a good question. So basically, it's much less defined than in Inspire. The reason being that in Inspire, there was a little bit too much specification, especially in the implementing rule already, which made it very hard to basically adjust for errors that were found, or also to just keep up with changes. So this is something that should be noticed. And now in this case, there was quite strong opposition from some member states to again have very strict rules about the type of APIs that are in the Act. So from my perspective, ideally, you should all use APIs that are actually standardized to the largest degrees. And let me go back to that briefly. So don't build custom APIs all the time. Try to use the standardized ones as much as possible. And only if really there's good reasons to do something else, then go with a custom one. And even if you do, you still need to comply to the rules about terms of use shall be available in a human readable and machine readable format and so on. So basically, that's something that you could fulfill with an open API based API. Emmanuel, just let me know if that's something that we should still expand on. Otherwise, I would continue with Jari's comment on bulk download. He mentions that Inspire WFS is only applicable if paging is supported. That's correct. Generally, an Inspire WFS 2.0 should support paging. So compared to WFS 1, there is actually paging standardized properly. So from my perspective, that should be fine. On ODC API processes, indeed, that would also be an option. It's a good one, and might actually also make sense for tabular data. So it's a good idea. I hadn't actually thought of it in this context. So yeah, could be added here for sure. Yeah, Emmanuel also asked about data licensing. Is there any existing common European one? Well, I only know of the UPL for software. I'm not sure if there's a European data license, but the fact that the implementing act basically points to Creative Commons to me suggests that that's basically what we should be looking at. So, and Creative Commons it's not really originally intended for data, but it's such a small minimal license that it's pretty universally applicable. So from my perspective, it's fine to also use it in this context. Then we have a question by an anonymous attendee. And that is, should data documentation be provided in English or may it be only a national language? Well, I didn't find a requirement that explicitly says something about the language. So I would assume that any EU language is actually acceptable. But of course, again, it's a question of, do you want to make the data more accessible and reusable? And if it's in a language that fewer people speak, like, I don't know, German or French or whatever, not everybody's speaking compared to English, or less people are speaking, then obviously they will have to rely on some translation service to understand that. But yeah, I didn't find anything that clearly says you have to use English. It would have been surprising to me if there was that. So I'm assuming you can use other languages as well. Jari has also posted that the actual point for delivery of the reports is actually not in December, but in February 2025. Yeah, okay, could be. I was also not 100% sure. Yeah, so could be, yeah, that's the dates. Keeping this, we can keep that open and see if there's any other understanding. Then Ulla has the question, is this valuable, easy to understand and concrete reading of the HVD requirements available in FX and official guideline? I must admit, I don't fully understand that question. So maybe Ulla, if you could expand on that, that would be quite helpful. Meanwhile, I would take on the other ones. So Nina asked about what about the case that an administrative fee is paid for the use of data? Does the HVD assume that all data provided must be freely accessible? It's clearly the latter. So if you provide data under the conditions of Creative Commons, you may not charge for the use of the data. That's really the intent here. However, there is kind of a grace period from my understanding. So what we've heard is that there are some organizations that really have substantial income from data sales that would basically go away with this implementing act. And for those organizations, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understood is that they have like an up to 2-year exemption so that they can organize different funding structures. But in general, they are not exempt from making data freely accessible, so without cost. All right. Then Jan asked, does your platform at the moment support APIs for only tabular data? The response to that is yes-ish, not optimal in my view. Like I said, we've been looking around for different options for doing that, and you do need to tweak it a little bit because, for example, the way that we currently treat metadata on our platform still requires you to provide a spatial component, and you might have to manually enter that. One way that you can use that is by always submitting like your national extent in addition. So because the tabular data likely still has to do with that. But what we don't have is a proper API for only tabular data. So there is one, it's called the resource service, but we haven't yet been exposing that a lot. And so we're currently internally discussing whether that's the right way forward. So super interested also in your feedback, whether you have an idea for how you would ideally like to access tabular data and whether maybe you have some national standard or the like for that we should be looking at. All right, reporting end 2024. What is if you got exempt for 2 years? So the reporting is always at the national level. And in that reporting, there will be a mention of the public organizations that are exempt with specific reasons for that. But so every country will have to deliver that report. That's my understanding, even though certain organizations might still have been, have been exempt. Okay. We have another deadline for the publication of HVD is 1st of July. Yeah, I think we have to clarify that one a little bit after that to find which of the dates is really the one to do what. What is the best solution to describe semantic and data model for data that is not Inspire identified? Ooh, that's a very broad question. It really depends on the complexity of the data model, in my view. So for like a really complex data model, I would still do something that's more formal, like actually UML-ish or similar approach. For a simpler data model, something like YAML or JSON schema or a simple XML schema with some documentation in addition is also fine. What I would only at the end consider really is to go full ontology or the likes, because there you typically need another level of modeling expert so that can really have some benefit. If it's mostly about describing the meaning and the structure of your data, something like UML or the like is entirely fine. Then we have from Ayosa the question about granularity. Is the only requirement that one should publish geodata to 1 to 5,000, or should granularity of data also be categorized, for example, 1 to 10, 1 to 50, 1 to 100,000? So the way that I read this is that you should be publishing all these variants. However, yeah, you would also indicate in the metadata in the quality criteria what the scale is. Okay, Vidike has counted the number of Inspire themes and came to 25. Okay, so I obviously forgot some or discounted them. Then Ulla has said, okay, is there an official guideline to help implementation of the HVD requirements? Some of the info you provide reading are not obvious when reading the IA. In some cases, it is a matter of interpretation. We know that from Inspire. And then I complimented your presentation. Yeah, so yeah, thanks a lot. So basically, what we're currently seeing is a lot of these questions. Yeah, we got, I don't know how many questions on high-value datasets implementation in the past months. And from my perspective, there are clearly gaps in in the interpretation in a few places, and especially also in kind of best practices. And there is some discussions going on, but in my view, there is on these items, there isn't like any final decision. What I would really suggest is that, I mean, we're also happy to support the community there to find the appropriate good or best practices and make sure that, yeah, things are really working and interoperable without creating too much effort. Whether there's an official guideline, I'm personally not really aware of one. There has been, for example, in the Inspire MIG, some discussions and presentations that I also took some info from. I also read all the background documents and so on, and really tried to make that into this presentation. But it's like I said, there's clearly items where there's still uncertainty, and we still need to resolve these. Whether then there will be one official guideline or whether it's something that member states will do, I'm not sure. Right now, I mostly see the member states coming up with some specific solutions. Yari mentioned date for delivery is 9th of June. That's also the date that I thought it is. And Aurete asked, can we consider that all Inspire datasets are high-value datasets? From my perspective, no, not all Inspire datasets are high-value datasets. There are a few themes that are out of scope. So yeah, however, there's, as mentioned before, there's quite a lot of overlap. So for the majority, it's certainly true. Then Henry Gressel asked, how about national open data license, EG Datenlizenz, Deutschland Namensnennung 2.0? My reading is clearly yes, this can also be used. What needs to be changed is that, for example, the European Data Portal actually recognizes that license as a standard license. At least in the past, like until 2 or 3 months ago, when I last checked, that wasn't yet the case. So yeah, that's basically the goal. As long as the conditions of the license, of the national license you want to use, are basically not more restrictive than Creative Commons CC BY 4.0, then you can use that. And for the one that you've mentioned, Datenlizenz Deutschland Namensnennung, in my view, that's given. Okay, and Wiedeke just mentioned that there is a link for the Netherlands that also describes, has some fact sheets to help about the implementation and its history. All right, so that was quite a lot of questions. But geology theme for sure is considered an HVD. Yes, geology is among the list. So if we go back here, geology is right there. All right. So with 15 minutes on the questions, one last thing that I would like to do is actually use the opportunity that there's many of you here and do a couple of quick polls before we then come to the conclusion. So given what you've heard today, I would first like to actually hear what kind of challenges do you still see after today's call? Giving you about a minute or so to answer the poll. We have about 90 people who've responded now. Things are slowing down, so I'll keep it open a few more seconds. And I'm closing the poll. Thank you very much, everybody. So I assume you can see those now. Basically, about 50% still say clarification of requirements, internal prioritization, coordination, and approval. That's a classic. 59, that's the top one, available stuff. That kind of matches what we saw before. Yeah, and then the other things are less in focus. All right, then let's have a look at the second poll. Back. So the second poll is basically, given what you've just seen, do you already have a preferred implementation variant for the APIs that you're taking into consideration? Again, you can have multiple choice. I'll keep it open another minute or so. Meanwhile, thanks, Nina, for the comment and the feedback. Yeah, I think there might be one when we're actually at the point that we can have an end-to-end good practice for how to implement this. We can probably do another webinar on the subject. I'll close the poll in about 10 seconds. All right. So it looks like Web Feature Service 2.0 is the preferred option, 64%, followed by API features and coverage services. Yeah, and then we have also 13 that have responded none. That's going to be the interesting ones, I guess. Also, the 8 people that responded other would really be interesting, kind of here in the comments or things like that, in the question and answer, what others you would actually consider. So we had already API processes. Maybe you have, other ideas as well. Wolfgang just asked, yes, I did mean OGC API feature. Okay, then let's go back. Next one. Same question as before, but this time for the preferred bulk download options. So do you have preferred bulk download options? Like, do you directly use the APIs or atom feed or stack or similar options? Okay, in 10 seconds, I'll close the poll. All right. Share the results. So yeah, just using the APIs is a favorite, but also directly linking to the respective archives. That's an Inspire with a simplified linkage, for example. Yeah, also atom feed is still quite high up on the list. I guess, yeah, maybe it's not the most user-friendly, but it's very universal. So maybe not fully surprising. I would have thought that more people would like to use Stack though. So that's not that common yet. All right. Then we're almost at the last step. So this now is basically a question that's similar to one we asked already in the preparation, but we also wanted to A, use the larger community that's here, and B, see whether you might have new considerations, basically. 10 seconds to go. All right, I'll close the poll. Yeah, might also be interesting. So basically for most people, as pretty much in the pre-survey, self-operated open source products on spot one, working together with others, using solutions from other agencies or IT centers, two, software as a service in place three, self-developed custom-built solutions still following that, and then self-operated proprietary products, basically in the last. Yeah, great. So let's go to the last one, actually. And that question is, how many additional data sets will you provide as open data through the High-value Datasets Implementing Act? In addition to what you have already published under Inspire or other obligations. So basically really what new resources will be made accessible, in particular through as open data. Thanks, Jari. See you soon. The first people are leaving. So yeah, we also wrap up this poll, and that's then it. Yeah, interesting to me is that about 50% of people are not yet sure how much data really falls under that. So that I guess means that there's some homework to do to really investigate what's affected by this act, what hasn't been shared yet. But there's also quite a few that say none. So basically they've done their work already. Maybe Ulla might be one of these. So some countries really have a very far-reaching open data policy already. Yeah, and that basically concludes the survey. So thanks a lot, everybody, for participating in that. I think it's always interesting to get some feedback also on the presentations and where you stand and what you plan to do next. So yeah, we're pretty much at the end of the presentation. So I can only say thank you very much for taking the time out of also your busy schedule and joining us for today's presentation. And yeah, I can only say now, if you need to know anything, please reach out to us. I think you know how to do so. And otherwise, just go for it. I'm really looking forward to the implementing of this act and basically seeing really more data becoming fair.